Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the GALA webinar. My name is Allison Furch. I'm the Executive Director at GALA. For those of you that don't know, GALA is a nonprofit trade association connecting and supporting the global language industry. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Danielle Marcos from Tableau Software and Jeff Beatty of Mozilla Corporation. We're going to be talking about cultural intelligence and why it matters in our industry. Before we get started, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. By now, you're all pros at digital platforms, but just a few reminders. You are all muted and you'll remain so for the duration of the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, you can use the chat box and I'll help you troubleshoot whatever's going on. Sometimes a slow internet connection might mean that your audio is disrupted, and if that's the case, you can always switch over to a telephone connection, and there's the call-in number should be in your GoToWebinar panel. We are indeed making a recording of this presentation. Just going to check that we are recording. We are, and we will be posting that on the GALA website later. You can find it there. If you have any questions for our presenters or comments or points to share, since this is more of a conversation, please type them in anytime during the presentation and the chat feature in the GoToWebinar panel for that. So next, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Danielle Marcos is a program manager for the Global Customer Solution Readiness team at Tableau, which is now a Salesforce company. She's also an instructor in the Certificate in Localization, Customizing Software for the World at the University of Washington. That is a professional development postgraduate program. She holds an MA in Translation and Intercultural Communication from the Universidad de Salamanca. Most recently, she has been leveraging her advanced CQ, we're going to hear more about that, facilitation skills to help others build brand resilience through cultural awareness. Jeff Beatty is the Senior Head of Localization at Mozilla, the makers of the open source web browser called Firefox, as well as an adjunct faculty member at Brigham Young University and soon to be at NYU as well. He holds an MS in multilingual computing and localization from the University of Limerick. He also has been featured as a community and localization expert in prominent global publications. So thanks both for joining us. Welcome. Before we get started, do you want to add anything more about your background?
I think that was great, Allison. Thank you.
Okay, well then we can just jump right into the conversation. So the topic for today is cultural intelligence, and I would say that it's well understood that cultural intelligence and cultural sensitivity is a critical skill set in our industry. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? You know, maybe people take that for granted or don't think it through. Maybe could you start at the high altitude and talk a little bit about why that's important and why it matters in our industry?
Jeff, you want to start us off on that? I know you're well versed in that.
I mean, I think that it definitely can be taken for granted. I think it's really easy to take it for granted in our industry because our industry is global by nature. We are working with people across the globe from different cultures, and very often we you know, the international aspect and nature of our profession assumes a certain level of cultural intelligence. But I think that there are skills that one has to explicitly develop in order to be successful at working internationally, and not just internationally. I mean, cultural intelligence doesn't just apply to, you know, one region versus another, or one culture in one region versus another. Cultural values are found at every different level within a society. There are different cultural values held by people in different generational groups, different companies, different political leanings. And I think that we often just kind of assume that people have these skills without encouraging or really knowing how to invest more deeply in them.
Danielle, you want to add anything to that?
No, I would say that I think maybe tying it to how I came across to this program or this genre within our field is that having a little bit of a background in intercultural communication and having gone through that route at the university level, and then I would say just I had read a Harvard Business Review article and I saw the term cultural intelligence and I said, what is this? And I start reading the article and I'm like, wait a second, I'm doing some of this stuff and some of this other stuff. I know that it's part of the expectation of people that are in my field in this domain of localization and globalization. And so I kept reading and I was really intrigued and I just started doing, as I do, a lot of Google searches that lead me to a lot of different educational rabbit holes, as I like to say, with really good positive endings. And all of a sudden I found this center and they had a certificate program, which was really appealing. I like a little bit of structure and formalization. So I just wanted to learn more, as you do, right? And being in a field that I know we are surrounded by a lot of people that are very, very eager to continue reading and learning and expanding their horizons. I was on that journey, but in a different domain that I didn't know how much of it was actually overlapping with what I had already been studying, but just under a different name or an expansion of it.
Mm-hmm. So that Harvard Business Review article was kind of the catalyst for you. Jeff, what about you?
I would say that, yeah.
Okay. What led you to cultural intelligence specifically? I mean, it sounds like Danielle sort of found her way there, maybe not so intentionally, but serendipitously. How about you?
So for me, the primary introduction to cultural intelligence happened as I've worked with Mozilla's global community. We have had to arrange for in-person training workshops all across the world and had to bring together people from varying cultures. And given the extensive amount of travel and the unique region focus on each of these workshops, I've had to become much more aware and much more sensitive to the way that I am perceived and the messages that I am putting out into the world in interacting with these different people from specific regions. I think that kind of opened the door. And then as I got into people management and emotional intelligence, it gradually the focus shifted over into cultural intelligence because a lot of the people that I manage are from very different cultural backgrounds, and I wanted to be able to be the best coach and best mentor that I could be for those individuals. So I found the CQ Center, and one of the things that made me go through this particular course was the fact that this was a course that was not focused on one region over another, but it was focused on the broad skill set that could be acquired and then utilized in a whole host of different settings that I had never really considered before.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I've really enjoyed learning about that and finding ways to apply that as I've had political discussions with my family members or a whole host of different scenarios where those skills have been really useful.
Thinking about the people that are on the call today, I wonder whether this was something that came, like Mozilla is a fairly large corporation. Was this something that really was your brainchild, or was this something that came from HR? Do you think that globalization and localization teams or companies are uniquely positioned in this scenario because of our exposure to so many languages and cultures? And would you suggest that the localization team might lead the charge if their company isn't doing enough?
I think that the localization team within a company can have that role. This wasn't a directive from HR for me necessarily. It was more born of the fact that I had made a lot of mistakes that had inhibited our ability to engage and mobilize our volunteer community in specific regions.
We're
And I wanted
going
to
to get to
understand
those mistakes.
why. Yeah, I won't
Yeah.
get into those now, but I wanted to understand what those mistakes were, how they happened, and I realized that the more I could understand and the better and more flexible I could be, the more success I would have at creating sustainable communities.
Okay, so you both chose more of a formal educational route in this sense. What led you to the CQ Center, for example, and maybe what would you say to a person that says, I don't need to do training on this. This is all kind of natural, intuitive stuff. I could just, figure it out on my own. Why formal, sort of curriculum?
So for me specifically, and I had a very different experience from Jeff as we were prepping for this and how we've collaborated in all the articles that we wrote. I actually went on site. I was shipped to Austin, which to some of the points that Jeff has mentioned, it's not just international cultures, it's domestic. So going from Seattle, Washington, not being a native of Seattle, Washington, and then getting shipped to Austin, Texas to do this program, which was a 3 or 4 day endeavor, was also, there were a lot of domestic subcultures that I feel I was already exposed to before I was even getting through the course or even completing it. So I had a very on-site, very traditional model. But for me, it's the way that I learn and I know about myself. So structure for me it just worked well. And secondary to that, I would say is I just have a vocabulary now that I didn't know before. And so I could have, and I think that I maybe ran into more of an ad hoc version of knowing bits and pieces of it, but it just wasn't enough for me. I really wanted to know more and hence going down the more formal education side of things. So yeah, I would say that's kind of how the CQ Center just happened to have a certificate. Could have been any institution. And I think that as what we're living through nowadays and what the future holds for us, which is very, very unknown of how normalcy and all that will unfold, this is not going to me, my prediction is that this will not be an uncommon course or subject matter that other universities or other institutions or brand new academic places will start to offer a course or a full-on certificate. So yeah.
I was attracted to this because, like Danielle, I needed a vocabulary. And that's kind of my post-bachelor education has been, I learn a lot of things and acquire a lot of skills first, and then later learn what they're called when I when I undertake like an actual formal structured course. So that's how it was with my master's degree. A lot of the stuff that I learned as part of the program, I'd already really learned on the job, and I learned by doing. I just didn't know what it was called, and I didn't know what the best practices were necessarily. And that's really what the master's program gave me. It gave me a network, and it gave me a vocabulary to start from. The other thing that really appealed to me about this particular program and this setup was that the program is not just aimed at helping you to become more culturally intelligent, but the aim is to train you to train other people and train you to coach other people. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the highlights of my career has been having the opportunity and ability to coach and mentor other individuals. And so to have kind of an accolade or accreditation behind me saying, yes, not only have you had this experience, but you are authorized to go and teach people and help coach and mentor people, that was really appealing for me.
Yeah. Let's talk about how you've applied some of the things that you've learned. So I think you guys mentioned in your blogs that CQ Center talks about 4 capabilities, and I'm wondering if you could maybe quickly summarize those for us and talk about how you've applied them. Give us some examples.
Yeah. So do you want me to start with that, Danielle?
Go for it, Jeff.
Okay,
Rock and
I'll do the
roll.
first two if you want to do
Okay.
the other two. Um,
Okay.
so there's CQ Drive and CQ Knowledge first off, and these are kind of chronological. You have to have a sufficient amount of CQ Drive or motivation, incentives to go out and explore new cultures. But that drive is all about identifying what those motivations and incentives are. CQ Knowledge is the actual act of building up your own, I guess, mental database of knowledge about how different cultures work in different interaction points.
And then the last two are CQ strategy and CQ action. And so strategy is thinking about how well am I preparing myself for these interactions for different, or being able to tackle different issues. And then lastly, CQ action is what's my action plan? So here I have the incentive, there's a bit of a strategy, I have the incentive, I have the knowledge, here's a strategy, how am I putting all of this together to act on it?
Jeff, you want to talk about how you've applied it, maybe something that's gone well?
Sure. And this is actually something I did before I even took the course. And later have been able to reflect on this experience and actually label it as I've reflected on it. We had a sustainability problem within our Arabic speaking community. Our Arabic speaking community is spread throughout a lot of different Arabic speaking countries. And so we realized that we needed to do something. We needed to intervene and try to bring some continuity, stability, and unification to that group of individuals participating in our localization program. So we arranged a workshop to take place in Amman, and we arranged to bring people from Tunisia, from Palestine, Jordan, Algeria, and Egypt, and I'm probably forgetting one other place. But the point being, it was a very multicultural interaction, and we tried also to invite as many men as we did women, and to try to create a good sort of balance. But I realized that like my motivation for doing this was the sustainability of this effort, and where we had to mobilize Arabic speakers in the past, and failed to do so because of the lack of social interaction at the time, I realized that we needed to invest more long-term in those relationships of trust in order to mobilize that community in the future. So that was my motivation, my drive. In preparing for going to Jordan, I actually had a student at BYU who had lived in Amman for 4 years. And so I took him to lunch and sat down with him and said, okay, this is the challenge in front of me. How do I not make myself look like an idiot? Like, how do I reach these people? And you know, I acknowledge that I'm a foreigner. I'm not going to hide that fact. But how do I meet them at their level? And it was a fascinating conversation that I had with him, and I was able to accumulate a lot of knowledge along the way. And with that knowledge and with that motivation, I could create a strategy. So the format for our event there took a different shape than with other places. We tried to really recognize the prominence of the leadership roles in the community and leverage that as a mentorship role and establish people as mentors to everyone else. We also planned for a number of cultural activities, and we sat back and let the local Jordan community really take the reins there and arrange for all of the needs to be able to transport the group from one place to another. And they were our guides. They introduced us to all of this new food. It was a wonderful cultural exchange, and for them it was very rewarding to be able to share that. But anyway, that was strategy. And then action, like all of this preparation, there were some instances of some cross-cultural conflict, especially when it came to some questions of leadership and trust. And I found myself having to pivot and find different ways to be able to connect with people in different areas, or from different regions. And luckily, I'd invested enough time in researching and understanding the differences and the nuances that I could successfully make those types of pivots in those multicultural interactions.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, when you say sustainability, do you mean like staff turnover? You were seeing too much. You position this as a sustainability challenge, and I just want to
Yes.
clarify what that means.
So the sustainability challenge, every community that we have has a different sustainability challenge because of the cultural nuances. With Arabic, the challenge was that we had some longtime veteran members of our community who held all of the knowledge of what style we used to localize, the terminology we used, and it was very difficult to get from them that information.
Okay.
And so people would come, they would make contributions, and either the leadership would kind of steamroll those contributions and just translate over them, or they just wouldn't mentor people. And so bringing everybody together was a good opportunity to try to establish some norms around mentorship and expected behaviors in those types of situations, and was an opportunity to really elevate those leaders as mentors.
Okay, that helps. Yeah, and I would imagine that a number of the people on the call can relate to a scenario like that. Danielle, what about you? Can you give us an example of a win, a success story for you?
Absolutely. I would say that so I was working with a colleague of mine who her focus has been training and facilitating on a variety of different subjects, from onboarding new hires to working with different communities within our organization and supporting them in different modalities. And one day she was very, very frustrated. I would say almost in tears about something that happened in that interaction. And I was curious, of course, me being who I am. I said, so I had my own drive there to say, hey, what happened? What's going on? You know, and also to tend to her needs. And she expressed that she was very frustrated because she had just come out of all these facilitations, long hours, especially in the virtual sense of how we've been conducting a lot of business, obviously in the last year. And it was focused on the fact that here she was in her mind, putting herself out there, being very real, as to use her terms, and asking and soliciting for feedback, like on the spot, about some of the content that she had either rewritten or had adapted some previous feedback that she had received, and was putting people, essentially, as I was diagnosing this when I was hearing the story, putting people on the spot.
Mm.
And what she didn't understand was, why was she getting a lot of feedback from one group but not so much from another group, and kind of in the middle from another group. And so I wanted to and she had, if we apply the CQ capabilities to this, like, she had the drive to want to improve. So she knew there was a problem. She just had run out of options, essentially, of what else can I do. And excuse me, and being positioned the way I am, of kind of the cultural go-to, although I tell people I'm not the bottleneck. You too are cultured. You too are human. You too know. Let's learn together. We basically started having these kind of interactions between her and I, where we would have just like a few meetups here and there to kind of discuss like what was really her perception, what was really going on, and what she wanted to achieve the next time that she rolled something out in that mode. And the group that we decided to kind of focus on was a group from Japan. And of course, all of us from the localization side of the business, we know that Japan, when we're localizing, when we're producing content, holds a very high standard and a very high bar. But the cultural side of things is that, you know, based on certain nuances and based on certain values, you know, there's the concept of saving face. There's a concept of privacy. There's a concept of, you know, don't put people on the spot necessarily. And that's where she was losing that momentum, and she didn't know. And so what she wasn't gathering was the feedback she was expecting and comparing it to other groups. So what we ended up doing was we started tweaking a few things and modifying a few things to say, okay, what would a really short survey that's asking for very specific feedback about the training and not you look like in an anonymized version? What would, you know, maybe embracing emojis in that Zoom capability? What would it look like if, for instance, you were adjusting the tone of your follow-up emails, or even the tone of how you would express what you were trying to get out of, if you wanted to kind of keep it real, essentially? What would the tone and the message look like? What would it look like if you didn't target yourself, right? Like, you're being real, but they're seeing you as an authority, but also be cognizant. And this was part of that coaching that we did. So taking this kind of not so great moment and turning it into a success, was there was a mixture of hierarchy. There were managers of managers mixed with individual contributors, all within that same facilitation group. And of course, no one in that culture is necessarily, at least from my experience and the literature I've read, is they're not really going to come around and say, you know, you're not doing great, or this could be better, or you know, I'm bored kind of thing, right? That expression. You can very much get feedback, but you have to be a little bit more creative, and you have to be a little bit more sensitive and meet them at that point. So it was a great interaction, many interactions with her. And then the best part was when she actually ran with the new program, and she saw the work that she had put in at the beginning, which she didn't really see how it would all turn out. But essentially, she had a very, just like in localization, she had something very much catered to the Japan office and our subsidiary versus stuff that could work or be adapted, lightly modified for other regions or other subcultures, essentially. So she was very happy. And then now she's just like, okay, whenever you have some like cultural stuff, you need to talk to Danny. Talk to Danny. She knows all the cultural stuff. I'm like, you now know yourself. So now you can coach. So tying it back to that train the trainer aspect of what I think in listening to Jeff, what drew both of us to just getting a more formalized backing and education is to be able to say, now I'm handing the baton to you, go forth, and you're going to commit a lot of cultural sins, but you're going to reap a lot of really great interactions. So, and she just now has a great trust, great level with that group.
Good. Well, that's a nice segue, actually, Danielle, to the flip side of that coin, which is failure. And we all commit cultural faux pas, and we all have failed interactions, multicultural interactions. And I would like to say we probably don't know about many of them that have failed, but sometimes we're lucky enough to know. I wonder if you'd be willing to share some examples, an example maybe, Jeff, of a time where it didn't go so well, and maybe what you
Yeah,
learned.
I have made the biggest mistakes when it comes to interacting with people from India. Um, I had certain, and this was years ago. I feel like I've grown a lot and been able to correct a lot of those mistakes. I didn't understand much about the level and norms around Indian hospitality. Um, and I also didn't really respect or understand the level to which social hierarchy was in place and was reinforced. I'm coming from, of course, a Western background, but also an open source background, where the ideal scenario is, you reap what you sow, basically, right? What you put in to an open source project, you often get back, and leadership is based on merit and not necessarily on who you are or where you come from, but what you've actually accomplished within the project. And so that mindset leads you very often to focus only on the people that are, for instance, visibly doing the work, right? And within Indian culture, or at least our Indian communities, the people that were doing the work were not the ones that were visibly doing the work, I should say, like showing up in our translation management system and things. They were not the ones that were designated as the leaders. But if I wanted to get something done, as with any other community that I'd worked with, I needed to just circumvent the leader and go to that person directly. I can't tell you the number of angry emails that I would get from leaders that were telling me about how disrespectful it was, that I wasn't respecting the chain of command. And I would retort back, this is open source. I can talk to whoever I want. But then I realized that created more obstacles and more barriers in our relationship of trust. So when it came time for me to visit India, or to have any other greater interactions or opportunities to mobilize our Indian communities, I had a lot of hurdles that I had to overcome because I had created them, basically through my lack of understanding. it's taken a few trips to India. It's taken a few webinars and a lot of study to come to terms with those failures and understand where I've made those mistakes and how I should have interacted differently. And so now, you know, for instance, I'll have my own directors ask me, you know, our region focus right now isn't India, and yet you want to spend money on a community workshop in India. Justify this. And I'll say, if we don't have a social connection with the people in India, if we aren't sharing, breaking bread together, if we're not enjoying one another's company and focused on a similar, on solving the same problem in the same room together, then we're going to lose them. So we need to invest in this, because even though our immediate short-term focus is not India, in the long term, we can't predict whether it will become a focus. And I don't want to regret not having invested in India. So yeah, I feel like I've grown a lot, but I also made quite a few mistakes in the process.
Yeah. How about you, Danny?
Yeah, for me, I would say it takes me back to when I was on the engineering side of the business. So now I sit in the sales, customer solution side of things. But when I was in engineering, I was a product manager for the internationalization team. And so a lot of my time was spent on our community pages. And so Tableau, very, very much a huge entourage of followers of all different levels of knowledge within the products. And so kind of to what Jeff actually said about breaking bread and creating those long-lasting relationships, like it had not been too long that the product had been shipping in different languages, yet the priorities and what leadership had decided as the markets that they were going to invest in were different from what was being expressed from our users on the community. And so again, on the theme of feedback, an area that I have struggled and I'm still growing in, especially when it deals with different cultures, is that I said, okay, great, I know exactly what to do. Earlier in my career, I'm gonna write a thing, and I'm going to just use that, and I'm gonna be efficient, and it's gonna be fabulous. Had I known what I know now and had the terminology that I have now, I would have completely taken that in a different direction. And the beauty is that I am taking things in a different direction, but I essentially created these, I'm seeking feedback. I want you to feel heard. I want you this. Tell me what we're doing wrong. Because I knew the influx of bugs and issues that were being reported on the actual tactical product back end side of things. And I wanted to somewhat be proactive, but also feel and let these communities know that they were being heard, especially for some of the languages I knew were not on the roadmap. And so I would just start copying and pasting these comments out, and it was crickets, silent, or it would go into a completely different direction that I did not want or expect it to go, and having to get myself out of these holes that I had kind of self-induced were pretty embarrassing, but also, life lessons of things. But yeah, it was an interesting ride when I was in development with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, with age often comes wisdom, not necessarily, but hopefully, right? Um, so I'm wondering about how you've been able to apply your skills to training the trainer or teaching others. You know, you've both talked about how this wasn't only about your own personal growth and elevation, but really about how you can become a resource to your teams. I wonder if you could share some examples of how that's worked for you.
Yeah, I can go first. So I am honored to be able to have a function as a mentor to a handful of individuals who like made that relationship formal and formally invited me to be their mentor, and it's been a really wonderful interaction. One of those individuals, he had just graduated from BYU, um, and he had been thrust into a leadership role in a translation company that was based in Japan. and his whole focus was on applied machine learning within this translation company. And most of the engineering and translation staff that he worked with were based in Japan, that he was meant to manage and lead. And I remember going to lunch with him, and he sat down, and I was asking him how things were going at his job. And he started telling me about how he just can't seem to break through to his Japanese coworkers. He can't seem to uh, get the feedback he's looking for. He can't seem to get any real engagement from them. It's difficult to get emails back or to even see progress on work like he would want to. And he was really at his kind of wit's end, trying to figure out how on earth he could successfully interact with and manage this group of individuals. So we sat down and we kind of talked through it. I asked him some specific questions about what he'd tried, shared some information about hierarchy and the way that leadership is perceived. So he had taken a kind of Western approach to leadership, and where he was not taking himself very seriously as a leader or as a manager. And so there was a lot of self-deprecating humor that he would put out there and everything. And I had to tell him that's probably not being well received to the group that you're managing, because you are the boss. And if you're down on yourself, that's not going to be reflected very well to them. And so like we had a lot of good interactions. The advice that I ultimately gave him was stop being self-deprecating, be authoritative. You are the boss, and represent yourself with confidence. I told him to find a cultural liaison. So find somebody within the company that has either an American that has transplanted themselves to Japan, or somebody from Japan working in America within the company. But find somebody that bridges the two cultures to function as a liaison to accept and take in the group's feedback and deliver it to you. Because the group likely is not going to give you direct feedback unless you establish a channel for anonymous feedback that would allow them to give that feedback honestly and directly while saving face for doing so. And he, after giving those recommendations, he came back about 2 months later and said it's been a night and day transition. Like I get feedback from them. When I ask them to do something, it gets done really quickly now. I stopped recognizing people publicly and like shining the spotlight on them, but sending instead private messages to encourage and thank them for work that they've done. And I feel like I have built a lot of respect and trust on the team thanks to this advice. So it was a really great experience for me to help him to tackle some challenges and equip him with some skill sets that would allow him to be more adaptable in that situation.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think noteworthy that you're not positioning yourself as the cultural authority, but you're facilitating for him maybe some strategies that, like going back to the four capabilities, he obviously had the drive, right, and maybe was lacking a bit on the knowledge and also strategy. What do I do next? And that's maybe where you come in, not necessarily being the knower of all things when it comes to
Right.
Japanese business culture. But okay, Danny, how about you? Can you give us an example? Your earlier story was, I think, also relevant here of coaching your colleague, but is there another one that you could share where, similar to Jeff, you kind of were able to grease the wheels at least, if not solve the problem entirely?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I don't know if I've solved the problem, but I've been identified as someone within this group that I support. So there was someone, this happened actually before I went through the whole program. And at the beginning of 2019, we had a leader who would come out and would, express a whole bunch of ideas at the onset of the year, and, his thoughts. And he was known as being someone that loved sports and sports analogies. And so every presentation had some sort of sport, but mainly American football. and he would start with American football and end with American football. And yet he would walk into the room and say, when we were in rooms and offices, he would walk into the room and say, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Most people stop there and think that they're being global. Cool. I acknowledge different time zones. And so this leader went off and started saying all these things as he did. Great speaker, by the way, fantastic speaker. And all of a sudden, there was the next interaction with him about 3 months later, second quarter, and he comes at it again and he says, I'm going to just let you all know, I've been told that I need to be more global. Now, this had nothing to do with me. I was not involved in this part yet. And he said, so I'm hoping that what I'm doing today is going to be far more global. So he does the same exact thing, but he replaces every football image with a rugby ball. And I thought, oh no. Like, you're on board to the right, you're on the right path, but he kept the same story, different imagery. So then I said, and especially at the company that I represent, there isn't that hierarchy where I need to go through someone in order to speak to this, leader. I just emailed this person directly and said, I could tell that, this was a huge battle that you're growing in. It's something along these words. I don't remember quite well how I wrote that email, but he gave me 5 minutes of his time and he's like, well, how can I do better? Right. And so having a little bit of, okay, I'm aware that I didn't do as good as I thought, or that I'm not done, that there's still some growth. So the next quarter comes around, he now has his slide deck, his PowerPoint presentation where he has a football, American football, a rugby ball, and a soccer ball. And I said, well, at least he listened to me, because at least he's, reaching a larger scope now. So and now whenever I see this person, or interact with him, I know that he knows who I am. I know that he's trying to be better, and he knows, just like myself, that we're going to continue making mistakes all the time, just to Jeff's point. Like, this is an ongoing journey. We don't just stop and we're done with culture, right? And so that right there was actually something that I used, because that was the beginning of 2019. I used that as an example, as part of my business case, to say, this is why I need to go and do this with the cultural intelligence certificate and whatnot. So I think it was meant to be eventually that I'd go and formalize this. So it was kind of cool to be able to coach someone at his level without formally setting anything up. But he did have to apologize quite a bit afterwards to the wider group. So
Cricket. We've got about 15 minutes left in the hour, and we do have some audience questions that I'd like to get to. If it's okay with you guys, can we shift gears and look at some of the audience questions together? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So I think I'm going to actually go out of order here for those of you that are that submitted questions. But Naz asked a question that is a nice segue from where you were, Danielle, which is, you were working or interacting with a high-level executive. The training that you've gone through clearly makes you valuable. It gives you a skill set that not everybody has at your company. Have you, or how will you communicate that value to your managers or to your groups, right? To decision makers about the importance of these skill sets, and maybe also take that opportunity to, promote what you and your localizer friends are doing?
I would say, so taking that example I just gave, right, of finding something that just didn't settle right and then trying to follow through with that. I tell my students at UW when they ask me as well, how do I get started when I don't have the role yet? How do I know I have some knowledge? And I say, well, look at some of the brands that you like or that you purchase, that you consume, and start finding bugs, start finding issues, start seeing things, write to their customer service, right, put on Twitter, whatever to create a little bit of noise, because as brands and as human beings, we don't want that, right? We want to make improvements on that kind of stuff. And so I would say that's one route. It's not something that I would do all the time, but it is something that's available. CQ, cultural intelligence, is essentially just prepping us to be able to work effectively across different groups of people and different subcultures and different domestic cultures and separate international cultures. So if I focus on the fact that it is to work effectively, what company, what team does not want to work effectively? And so it's then trying to have different stories, not just examples, but different stories that you can tie to that. And depending on the context or the group of people that you're working with, even within your team, to say this is an opportunity for this. One thing that I've learned about being in the field of localization and globalization is that if I just come out and say that is an L10N thing, I just lost them. They don't know what that is, right? And so I have to really perfect that elevator pitch or be creative in the space where I have enough of those more, I would say, layman terms, lay people terms, to say, this is my toolkit of different options that I have to be able to talk to different groups of people, because I can understand what register they're at with the knowledge that I'm about to just, very happily and very curious, just throw on them. And that way you're not just writing an email and saying, that was not culturally intelligent. You are not culturally intelligent. It's like, well, I don't think that your message was well intended the way that I don't think your message was well perceived the way you intended it to be. Let's talk, right? Or I think that you can do better. Here's an example. Or that image that you used on your PowerPoint presentation, or the way that you're talking to, to this group, just let me show you something else. But a lot of that has to be in confidence. You have to have the confidence to feel that you can follow up with that person, and also be cognizant of the level of feedback and how you approach that, because now you're dealing with someone you probably don't interact with every day. And so that right there is also an opportunity for you to grow as a culturally intelligent person, to say, how am I going to bridge that so that we can continue to foster this relationship, and they see that I'm just coming from a good place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I wonder, Jeff, if I can ask you to kind of do a bit of a corollary to that question, which is, so the original question was, really about how, localization evangelists, how do you communicate to the others, the decision makers and others in your company? The corollary to that is really the impact on a business's bottom line. Have you been able to, or maybe not yourselves, but have you heard stories of where this has really had an impact, on the P&L, for example? It's difficult to measure, right? Sometimes, but any even anecdotal evidence of that? Jeff, I'm putting you on the spot with that one.
It is incredibly difficult to measure. I think that it's incredibly difficult to measure ROI for L10N in general, let alone taking an additional step backward in layers of abstraction and trying to quantify the impact on that cultural intelligence has. But that being said, there is a global, I want to say, focus, I guess, or there's global momentum currently toward inclusion, diversity, equity in staffing, in user base, that's reflected in product, as well as an increasing focus on working cross-functionally and being kind of a jack of all trades. Well, in order to be able to do those things effectively, you need to have a high degree of cultural intelligence. And there have been numerous studies that have taken place both from the CQ Center as well as other institutions that demonstrate that diversity for the sake of diversity does not actually improve the bottom line. It does not spark innovation. In fact, it creates greater churn. And so when you're trying to manage costs and manage staffing resources, if you have a diversity initiative that is not backed and supported by individuals that have a high level of CQ, then you're likely to lose those candidates after they've been hired within a year. And then you're back to square one, having to hire new. And that churn can create a significant hit to not revenue necessarily, but it can increase your costs dramatically. So evangelizing cultural intelligence principles and skill sets within a company becomes critically important, because it becomes important to the business's overall objectives around creating a diverse and inclusive atmosphere across all teams at the company.
Okay, thanks. Let's switch gears a little bit. You talked a lot about national cultural identity. We've heard a lot about Japanese business culture today, and Jeff, you sharing some of the issues with your Arabic-speaking community. I wonder if we could switch and talk about some of the other kind of micro communities, or for example, age. There's a lot of articles that I see in the association space talking about working with millennials, for example, which is, I'm not one of them, and working across generations, or I don't know, we can think about any other kind of category. But when you did your training, was this also addressed? And, how important, I would say, are these subgroups when you're also talking about national identities?
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that. Ageism is definitely something that was mentioned, at least in my training when I went on site to Austin. Generational, definitely, which is ageism. I actually know someone who struggles a lot with this and has been very forthcoming to share. And it's been interesting to, you can't solve for it. The best, I think, in my approach, the best thing that you can do is listen and be an ally for them and include them in meetings, or give them recognition if you know how they like to receive recognition, just like you would from any other coworker in the space. So I would say just the same respectful coin that you use with people and the same level of dignity. It doesn't matter how old you are, right? We're basically saying we don't really mind where you come from. I'm going to treat you in a very respectful, human manner. And so that's how I've, in a short amount of time, been able to encounter that and also navigate that.
So I talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. For me, equity does not mean everybody gets the same. Equity means everybody gets what they need. And what cultural intelligence training does is it gives you a skill set to be able to meet people at their level and really invest your time and energy in coming to understand what they need from you, and helping you to be able to give them what they need. And so it doesn't matter if it's a millennial working with somebody from the baby boomer generation. It doesn't matter if you're white, or and someone else is Latinx, or there's a numerous amount of divisions of culture that you can find. The toolkit helps you to be able to relate to one another, and helps you to be able to find common ground and demonstrate respect for that individual by investing and coming to understand them. One of the points that they brought up in our training is that when it comes to like CQ knowledge, very often the only resources that are available are ones that describe stereotypical interactions or stereotypical cultural values of individuals in certain groups. And they don't advocate for adhering strictly to those stereotypes, but they do note that understanding and investing time in understanding those stereotypes helps you to be able to develop a strategy, an action plan to pivot to the individual needs of that person pertaining to that group, or an intersectional group of people. So I think that on a national or domestic level, it's the skill set helps you to invest in people, and invest in coming to a mutual understanding with people and a mutual level of respect. So investing in your own development of that skill set will help you to be able to interact with people. I would say that are very different from you, or that have very nuanced differences from you.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one more question, and it does maybe tie into what you were talking about there. What is available out there, you know, to use as a resource to learn about other cultures? And you were mentioning sometimes it falls into stereotype, but what would you recommend to a person that maybe doesn't have access? Like Jeff, you talked, for example, about having the student, and then that you could ask for information about Jordan, and then another scenario where you recommended a liaison, right, for your Japanese your colleague in Japan. But what about folks that aren't part of multicultural teams? Maybe they're in a smaller office. Do you have any suggestions about solid resources where they could begin to do some important learning, both about the cultural, I mean, I know we've talked about the skill set, but then there is that knowledge base too. Any
Yeah.
advice?
So I would start by saying that if you don't think that you have multicultural interactions on a daily basis, then you might need to look a little harder. Everyone is having multicultural interactions because we all come from different backgrounds and different places, and we are the summation of our experiences and the values that have been instilled in us since birth. And so there are resources if you're focusing on an international scale, if you're trying to find resources to increase your CQ knowledge on a region by region basis. There are a lot of culture specific books that are out there. There are websites and forums where people that have lived or people that are expats in certain countries talk about cultural distinctions. YouTube is a really interesting uh, place to go to as well for learning, because you have people from everywhere that are posting comparisons of American culture and Swedish culture, and what to do when you're in Iceland and what to not do. Like, you can find resources definitely online. There are plenty, and the advice that I'd give is, while it's important to look to those resources and internalize them, to not strictly adhere to those resources as like the rigid rule set for interacting with people in that culture. Use it as a starting point, and then when you make a mistake, fix it and adapt your understanding of how to engage with people from that cultural group.
I would add just to everything that Jeff said, and myself, you know, I'm struggling with the fact that we're not traveling as much as we used to. And so I love to cook, and I love to cook and learn about food from different parts of the world. And so I've been really leaning into a lot of the cooking shows within Netflix and YouTube and other platforms as well. Um, but to Jeff's point, I take that as just this is what I could have learned had I been at a social gathering with some people or at a conference. And so I'm just taking that knowledge and I'm just putting it in my toolkit. But I know that that's not the way that everyone from that culture associates with that, right? Not everyone from, you know, Iceland is going to love bland flavors. Just I'm aware that there is maybe a more bland type of diet or lack of, let's say, spices for their cuisine. That's just something I didn't know before. And so I would say that that's something that is readily available to a lot of us nowadays. And yeah, everything that Jeff said and more.
Okay, great. I wonder if you have any, oops, yeah. I wonder if you have any final kind of words of encouragement or, yeah, before we say goodbye. Either of you want to add anything?
I would say this is a completely learned capability. So it doesn't matter how much educational background or lack thereof of how you came to be in the place that you're in right now. It is definitely something that you can continue to grow and foster, and just that there's a community of people and just within localization that you can leverage and ask and learn from. So just do it. Just try it.
Cool.
Yeah, I would only say, add to that, this is all based on awareness, right? It's making yourself aware of distinctions, and that while there might appear to be some homogeneity in the working relationships that you have with individuals, start now to identify where there are differences that you didn't notice before. And when you start noticing that, that leads you to having a drive to find out more and then create strategies around how to have more successful interactions. As Danielle said, just start. Be aware, be cognizant of your surroundings and of the backgrounds of the people you're working with, and find ways to understand them better.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. Thanks for sharing your experiences, your learned expertise, and thank you to the audience also for joining us today. So with that, I'll just say enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and we hope we'll see you at another GALA webinar soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you
Bye.
very much.